Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to speak to you about a psalm that is whispered in palaces but often ignored in the streets. A psalm that the wealthy meditate upon but the poor recite without revelation. It is not because the poor do not love God, but because many have not yet understood the spiritual laws hidden in these words. This psalm is not poetry alone. It is a contract, it is a covenant, it is a spiritual economy. When David said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he was not speaking wishfully. He was declaring a reality born out of relationship. Want disappears where shepherding is understood. Poverty is not only the absence of money, it is the absence of revelation. The power of Psalm 23 as a covenant of provision is not found in its familiarity, but in its revelation. Many can recite it, but few truly live in the reality of it. When David declared, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he was not making a hopeful statement, he was announcing a spiritual law. A shepherd is responsible for everything in the life of the sheep: food, water, safety, direction, healing, and rest. The sheep does not work for grass. It does not worry about tomorrow's pasture. It does not calculate the seasons. Its only responsibility is to stay close to the shepherd. The moment the sheep understands who is leading it, anxiety disappears. In the same way, when a believer truly understands that the Lord is not only Savior but Shepherd, lack loses its authority over the mind and heart. This psalm is a covenant because it reveals a relationship, not a formula. Covenant means God binds himself to your care. Provision in the kingdom does not begin with money. It begins with trust. The world teaches people to depend on their own strength, their own connections, their own skills, but the kingdom teaches dependence on God. When God becomes your shepherd, he takes personal responsibility for your needs. That is why David could say, "I shall not want." He was not saying he would never face seasons of testing, but he was declaring that in every season, the shepherd would already have prepared what was necessary. Green pastures do not appear by accident. A shepherd leads the flock to places that the sheep could never find on their own. Likewise, divine provision often comes through divine guidance. Many struggle because they move without God, decide without God, and work without God. But when you follow the shepherd, even ordinary ground becomes green pasture. Even dry seasons become places of nourishment. The covenant of provision means that God does not merely give you something. He gives you himself as your source. When God is your source, the channel can change, but the supply never stops. Still waters speak of peace, and peace is a sign of trust. When a heart is at rest, it is because it knows the shepherd is near. Fear says, "What if tomorrow fails?" Faith says, "My shepherd is already in tomorrow." The poor in understanding often live in constant tension, but the rich in revelation live in quiet confidence, not because they have more money, but because they know who walks with them. The covenant says that God restores, leads, feeds, protects, and sustains. It is not based on your performance, but on his faithfulness. When this truth enters the spirit, it changes how a person prays, gives, works, and hopes. Prayer becomes communion, not begging. Giving becomes worship, not loss. Work becomes partnership, not slavery. Hope becomes expectation, not wishful thinking. The shepherd does not abandon his sheep. He counts them, calls them by name, and carries the weak. This is why Psalm 23 is not a funeral psalm. It is a living psalm, a daily confession that the God who called you has also committed himself to provide for you. Understanding the shepherd mentality versus the poverty mentality is a matter of how a person sees God and how a person sees himself. A shepherd mentality is rooted in relationship, while a poverty mentality is rooted in fear. The one who knows the shepherd believes he is cared for, guided, and protected. The one who lives in poverty of mind believes he is alone, struggling, and forgotten. This difference does not begin in the pocket. It begins in the heart. Two people can have the same amount of money, live in the same environment, face the same challenges, and yet one walks in peace and confidence, while the other walks in anxiety and hopelessness. The difference is not circumstance, it is perception. A sheep that knows its shepherd does not panic when the field looks dry, because it trusts that the shepherd sees beyond the present. But a sheep that does not recognize the shepherd will run at the first sign of trouble. In the same way, a believer with a shepherd mentality does not collapse when resources seem small. He understands that God is leading him, and where God leads, God provides. He does not measure his future by his present lack, but by the faithfulness of the one who promised. A poverty mentality, however, constantly measures life by what is missing. It speaks the language of not enough, too late, and never. This kind of thinking builds walls in the soul that block the flow of hope and expectation. The shepherd mentality is built on the word mine. The Lord is my shepherd. This is personal. It is not religion, it is relationship. When God is seen as personal, provision is seen as intentional. Nothing is random. Every step, every delay, every open door is understood as part of his leading. The poverty mentality sees God as distant and life as accidental. It expects loss more than gain and prepares for disappointment more than for victory. Faith, however, prepares a table in advance. It sets the heart in a posture of receiving because it trusts the character of God. Rest is another sign of the shepherd mentality. Sheep lie down only when they feel safe. They do not rest in danger. When a believer cannot rest, it often reveals that he has not yet fully entrusted himself to the care of the shepherd. The poverty mentality is always in survival mode. It is always rushing, worrying, and striving. It fears that if it stops, everything will fall apart. But the shepherd mentality knows that God works even while we sleep, that he orders steps even when we do not see the whole path, and that his power is not limited by our weakness. Gratitude also flows from the shepherd mentality. A sheep that is fed is content. A believer who recognizes daily provision, even in small things, develops a thankful heart. Thanksgiving opens the eyes to see what God is already doing, and what he is already doing becomes the seed for what he will do next. The poverty mentality overlooks blessings and magnifies problems. It forgets yesterday's deliverance and doubts tomorrow's provision. When the mind is renewed to see God as shepherd, fear begins to lose its voice. Trust grows, hope rises, and expectation is restored. The heart no longer asks, "Will I survive?" but declares, "I am being led." And when you know you are being led by the Lord, you can walk through any valley with confidence because you are not wandering, you are following. The revelation of divine rest in the midst of lack is one of the deepest mysteries of faith, because rest seems illogical when resources are few and pressures are many. Yet the psalm declares that the shepherd makes his sheep lie down in green pastures. He does not wait until everything is perfect. He commands rest even when the journey is not finished. This rest is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of trust. It is the quiet assurance that God is working even when the situation appears unchanged. Many people are exhausted not because they work too much, but because they worry too much. Worry drains the soul, but trust renews it. Divine rest means the heart is anchored in the character of God, not in the size of the bank account or the stability of the environment. When a believer knows that God is faithful, he can sleep in the storm. He can remain calm in uncertainty. He can praise while answers are still forming. This kind of rest is a spiritual position. It says, "I have placed the weight of my life on God, and I believe He will hold me." Lack may still be visible, but fear no longer rules. The storm may still rage, but peace governs the heart. Still waters symbolize a spirit that is no longer agitated by every report or shaken by every delay. Noise confuses, but stillness clarifies. In stillness, the soul becomes sensitive to direction. Many people run from opportunity to opportunity, from plan to plan, because they are driven by anxiety. But those who have learned divine rest move by guidance, not by panic. They wait for the shepherd's voice, and when he speaks, they move with confidence. This saves them from many mistakes that cost time, energy, and resources. Rest also restores strength. When the soul is constantly tense, it cannot hear, it cannot see, and it cannot receive. But when the soul is at peace, it becomes fertile ground for faith. The promises of God take root more deeply in a rested heart. A restless heart hears the word but doubts it. A rested heart hears the word and embraces it. This is why Jesus said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He did not promise to remove every burden immediately. He promised to give rest in the midst of them. In seasons of lack, divine rest becomes a testimony. The world expects despair, but it sees confidence. The world expects fear, but it sees hope. This quiet strength speaks louder than many words. It declares that God is real, that His peace is not dependent on circumstances, and that His presence is enough. Rest is a form of worship. It says, "I trust you more than I trust what I see." It honors God by believing that He is both willing and able to provide. When a believer enters this rest, striving is replaced by surrender. The heart stops fighting the future and starts leaning on the shepherd. This does not make a person passive, it makes him positioned. From that position, faith flows, prayer becomes confident, and expectation becomes steady. Even in the valley, even in the season of waiting, the soul can be still because it knows the shepherd is leading it toward green pastures. The secret of overflow hidden in trust is revealed when a believer learns to place his full confidence in the character and promises of God rather than in visible resources. Trust is not simply believing that God can bless, but resting in the assurance that He will do what He has spoken in His time and in His way. Many desire overflow, but few are willing to surrender control. The heart that insists on managing everything struggles to experience abundance because it is always calculating risk and protecting itself from loss. But the heart that trusts releases its grip and allows God to lead, and in that surrender, the door to increase begins to open. Trust shifts the focus from what is in the hand to who holds the future. When David spoke of his cup running over, he was not measuring the size of the cup. He was celebrating the faithfulness of the one who fills it. Overflow is not the result of human effort alone. It is the result of divine partnership. God does not merely add to what we have. He multiplies what we place in His hands. This is why small beginnings, when surrendered, become testimonies of great provision. Trust invites God into the process, and when God is involved, limitation is no longer the final word. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom, but fear always limits. Trust, on the other hand, opens the way for God to act beyond natural boundaries. The believer who trusts God with his time, his resources, his decisions, and his future discovers that God is a generous shepherd. He does not lead His sheep into lack, but into places where there is more than enough. This does not mean life is without challenges, but it means that in every challenge there is a supply prepared by God. Overflow is also connected to obedience. Trust expresses itself through obedience, even when the instruction does not seem logical. When God speaks and the believer responds, he steps into alignment with divine order. In that alignment, provision flows. Many block their own overflow because they hesitate, delay, or reason themselves out of simple acts of faith. But when the heart says yes to God, the path becomes clear and the hand of God becomes visible. Gratitude protects trust. A thankful heart remembers what God has already done and therefore expects what God will do next. Complaining weakens trust, but thanksgiving strengthens it. When a believer continually acknowledges God as his source, he creates an atmosphere in which faith can grow. In that atmosphere, the cup does not remain half full, it begins to run over. Overflow is never only for personal comfort, it is for divine purpose. God fills the cup so that it may spill into the lives of others. When trust is present, the believer is not afraid to give because he knows the shepherd will fill again. This cycle of trusting, receiving, and giving keeps the river of blessing flowing. The more the heart relies on God, the more freely God pours out. Trust, therefore, is not a passive feeling. It is an active posture of the soul that invites the abundant life promised by the shepherd. The secret of overflow hidden in trust is revealed when a believer learns to place his full confidence in the character and promises of God rather than in visible resources. Trust is not simply believing that God can bless, but resting in the assurance that He will do what He has spoken in His time and in His way. Many desire overflow, but few are willing to surrender control. The heart that insists on managing everything struggles to experience abundance because it is always calculating risk and protecting itself from loss. But the heart that trusts releases its grip and allows God to lead. And in that surrender, the door to increase begins to open. Trust shifts the focus from what is in the hand to who holds the future. When David spoke of his cup running over, he was not measuring the size of the cup. He was celebrating the faithfulness of the one who fills it. Overflow is not the result of human effort alone. It is the result of divine partnership. God does not merely add to what we have. He multiplies what we place in His hands. This is why small beginnings, when surrendered, become testimonies of great provision. Trust invites God into the process, and when God is involved, limitation is no longer the final word. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom, but fear always limits. Trust, on the other hand, opens the way for God to act beyond natural boundaries. The believer who trusts God with his time, his resources, his decisions, and his future discovers that God is a generous shepherd. He does not lead his sheep into lack, but into places where there is more than enough. This does not mean life is without challenges, but it means that in every challenge, there is a supply prepared by God. Overflow is also connected to obedience. Trust expresses itself through obedience, even when the instruction does not seem logical. When God speaks and the believer responds, he steps into alignment with divine order. In that alignment, provision flows. Many block their own overflow because they hesitate, delay, or reason themselves out of simple acts of faith. But when the heart says yes to God, the path becomes clear and the hand of God becomes visible. Gratitude protects trust. A thankful heart remembers what God has already done and therefore expects what God will do next. Complaining weakens trust, but thanksgiving strengthens it. When a believer continually acknowledges God as his source, he creates an atmosphere in which faith can grow. In that atmosphere, the cup does not remain half full, it begins to run over. Overflow is never only for personal comfort, it is for divine purpose. God fills the cup so that it may spill into the lives of others. When trust is present, the believer is not afraid to give because he knows the shepherd will fill again. This cycle of trusting, receiving, and giving keeps the river of blessing flowing. The more the heart relies on God, the more freely God pours out. Trust, therefore, is not a passive feeling. It is an active posture of the soul that invites the abundant life promised by the shepherd. Why faith activates heavenly supply is because faith is the language of the kingdom and the key that unlocks what God has already prepared. God is not limited in resources. Heaven is full, complete, and abundant. The limitation is never on God's side. It is on the side of human expectation and trust. Faith is the bridge between promise and manifestation. When a person believes, he aligns his heart with what God has spoken, and that alignment allows divine provision to flow into earthly reality. The scripture says that without faith, it is impossible to please God, not because God is difficult to satisfy, but because faith is the only posture that can receive what grace freely gives. Faith is more than mental agreement. It is a deep assurance in the heart that God is who He says He is and will do what He has promised to do. When faith is present, prayer changes from desperate begging to confident asking. The believer does not approach God as a victim of circumstances, but as a child approaching a faithful Father. This confidence honors God, and God responds to honor. Faith says, "I trust your word more than what I see, feel, or hear." In that declaration, heaven finds a place to act. Heavenly supply is activated when faith speaks. Words filled with faith create an atmosphere where God's power can move. Just as fear-filled words can open the door to defeat, faith-filled words open the door to divine intervention. The psalm declares, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." This is a statement of faith. It does not deny the existence of need. It denies the authority of lack. Faith does not ignore reality. It brings a higher reality into the situation. Faith also acts. When a believer steps forward in obedience, even when resources seem insufficient, he demonstrates trust in God's provision. Every step of faith is an invitation for God to show himself strong. In the natural, 5 loaves and 2 fish were not enough, but when they were placed in the hands of Jesus, multiplication occurred. The miracle was not in the bread, it was in the surrender and in the faith that offered it. Likewise, what you place in God's hands through faith becomes the seed for supernatural increase. Doubt questions God's willingness. Faith rests in God's character. Doubt says, what if it does not work? Faith says, God cannot fail. This inner confidence releases peace even before the answer appears. Peace is often the first sign that heavenly supply has been activated, because it means the heart has already received what the eyes have not yet seen. Faith also keeps the heart open. A closed heart cannot receive, but a believing heart remains expectant. Expectation is the soil in which miracles grow. When a person expects God to provide, to guide, and to sustain, he begins to recognize opportunities, divine connections, and timely help that others may overlook. These are not coincidences. They are expressions of God's faithful care. In the kingdom of God, faith is the currency that accesses the storehouse of heaven. It does not earn the blessing, but it receives it. Grace provides, faith receives. When faith rises, fear falls. When fear falls, the flow of divine supply is no longer blocked. Then the shepherd leads the soul into places of provision, and the heart learns that trusting God is not risky at all, but the safest place a person can ever be. Living in abundance through obedience and gratitude is a spiritual principle that flows from recognizing God as the true source of every good thing. Obedience is not mere rule keeping, it is alignment with divine order. When a believer chooses to walk in the ways of God, he places himself under the covering and guidance of the shepherd. This alignment positions the heart to receive what God has already prepared. Many desire the blessing, but few understand that the pathway to sustained abundance is found in a willing and responsive spirit. Obedience says, I trust your wisdom more than my own, and in that trust, the soul finds safety and provision. Gratitude deepens this alignment. A thankful heart acknowledges God's hand in every season, not only when the cup is full, but even when it seems small. Thanksgiving shifts the focus from what is lacking to what has been given. It opens the eyes to see the shepherd's care in daily details, in protection, in strength, in opportunities, and in grace. When gratitude becomes a lifestyle, the heart remains soft and receptive. Complaining hardens the spirit and narrows vision, but thanksgiving expands the soul and creates space for more of God's goodness to flow. Obedience often requires trust, especially when God's instructions challenge human logic. Yet every act of obedience carries a promise, and every promise carries provision. When the believer responds to God's word, he steps into divine timing and divine order. In that place, what seems impossible in the natural becomes possible through God's intervention. The shepherd leads and the sheep follows, even when the path is unfamiliar. Following brings the believer into green pastures prepared ahead of time, places of nourishment and rest that could not be reached by human planning alone. Gratitude protects the heart from pride when blessing increases. It reminds the soul that abundance is not self-made, but God-given. This humility keeps the flow of blessing pure and continuous. A grateful person becomes a vessel, not a reservoir. He understands that what he has received is meant to be shared, and in sharing, he experiences the joy of being part of God's generous nature. God entrusts more to those who honor him with what they already have. In seasons of waiting, obedience keeps the believer steady, and gratitude keeps the believer hopeful. Together, they form a powerful testimony of faith. They declare that God is faithful in every stage of the journey, that his timing is perfect, and that his purposes are good. This posture of the heart invites peace, contentment, and confidence, even before visible abundance appears. As the soul walks in obedience and thanksgiving, it begins to experience a deeper kind of prosperity, one that touches not only material needs, but also the inner life. Peace replaces anxiety, joy replaces heaviness, and assurance replaces fear. This is the abundance the shepherd promises, a life guided by his voice, sustained by his care, and filled with the quiet certainty that goodness and mercy are following every step, the absence of rest, the absence of trust in divine leadership.